Hi everyone, Professor Phil Travis here, Eastern Oregon University, History 480, American 20th Century, Part 1. It's week 5. This week we are looking at the involvement of the United States in the First World War during the presidency, of course, of Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, who of course is the only president to hold a PhD. He had a PhD in political science. He was born in Virginia. And he was also the governor of New Jersey, as well as the president of Princeton University. Woodrow Wilson was really, historically, has really been remembered as an ardent opponent of war. Um, though he did involve the United States in a military operation in Mexico before the outset of the hostilities in Europe, and while he did win re-election to a second term, in the election of 1916, he won that election to a large degree on the basis of keeping the United States out of the war in Europe, but of course, ultimately, circumstances leads to a declaration of war by Congress in 1917, and of course, Woodrow Wilson will lead the United States into war, and we'll see the First World War as like a vehicle um, to create a lasting world peace and a new kind of world order behind the League of Nations. These goals, of course, are really not achieved. But World War I is from 1914 to 1918, and this week we're going to be reading from our main book, the Glenn Jeansonne book. We'll be reading Chapter 6. In addition to Chapter 6, I have a collection of primary source documents in modules for the week that I want everyone to read and engage in the discussion forum. These documents are related to American civil liberties during the First World War. World War I was not a hugely popular war, and so the United States relied on propaganda, and it also relied on the passage of measures um, to ensure that, as they saw it, the safety of the home front, and to encourage individuals from openly opposing the war. So during the First World War, many don't know this. During the First World War, the United States had an internment program. There were several thousand German nationals living in the United States that were interned in camps during the First World War. Many Americans know about the Japanese internment program during the Second World War, but many Americans do not know about the internment of German nationals during the First World War. So we have a document on that in these collections of primary source documents that I've provided for you in modules. The United States also passed two acts, excuse me, two acts. One called the Espionage and the Sedition Acts. These two acts, the Espionage and Sedition Acts, and effectively these acts, which were ultimately heard by the Supreme Court and were upheld by the Supreme Court, these acts basically meant that in certain cases, vocal opposition to the American war effort could be a prisonable offense. And of course, the socialist union leader Eugene V. Debs, of course, was imprisoned for a speech he gave in Canton, Ohio. I have both Woodrow Wilson's call for the purpose of the war. I have Eugene V. Debs's statement before the court. I have Eugene V. Debs's Canton, Ohio speech, and that speech is quite long. But I have those provided in the primary source documents as well. I want us to think about civil liberties during wartime, and to what extent was the United States, or was the United States not, justified in making these certain limitations on American civil liberties during wartime. World War I, was a conflict that many Americans opposed. A lot of Americans felt that the United States should not be involved in European conflicts. And the policy of Woodrow Wilson was to keep the United States out of the First World War. He won election in 1916 largely on the basis of keeping the United States out of the First World War. However, Wilson's policy of neutrality, Woodrow Wilson believed in a world that would be ruled by, ideally, would be ruled by democracies and would be governed by equal and fair trade. He, of course, becomes the mind behind the League of Nations, which the United States never joined, actually, because of a polarizing political dispute in the United States between the Democrats, led by Wilson, and the Republicans, led by Henry Cabot Lodge in the Senate, over the various treaties that were agreed to at the end of the First World War. The United States never formally signed the Treaty of Versailles, which ended the war with Germany, of course. And the United States never joined the League of Nations, though the League of Nations, a sort of precursor to the United Nations, did come into existence and functioned reasonably well for about a decade, though ultimately, of course, failing in the lead up to the Second World War. But Wilson had these ideas about the world. He wanted the United States to kind of lead the world in a new era of peace, and he hoped that the First World War might act as a vehicle for that. Once the United States had made the decision to intervene, he hoped that the United States would become the champion of the League of Nations, would become the champion of expanding democratic principles to the developed world, and would promote the ideas of national rights and free trade and freedom of the seas and these types of things in an effort to create a more prosperous and peaceful world. Ultimately, Wilson's neutrality before getting involved in the war, before the United States being pulled into the war, was somewhat flawed. And this was because Wilson believed fundamentally in this principle of free trade, that neutral powers should have the right to trade with whoever they wanted. And as a result of that sort of ideal, Wilson's neutrality program pulled the United States into the war. Wilson believed that the United States had a right to trade with everybody. However, because the British were blockading the German coastline, the United States wound up naturally trading more with the British. And as a result of the fact that all of the American trade was going to the British, the Germans then targeted shipping that was going to Great Britain. And that use of what was called unrestricted submarine warfare was a huge controversy, and one of the factors that ultimately pulls the United States into the war in 1917. Though there are other factors, things like the Zimmerman telegram to Mexico and so forth, that also played a role in a critical role in pulling the United States into war. Um, so Wilson's policies, in a way, kind of pulled the United States into the war, and the war was not hugely popular in the United States. There wasn't a majority that opposed it, I would say, but it wasn't nearly as popular as you would expect from something like the Second World War, and that led to the United States having to take actions with things like the Espionage and Sedition Acts. During the First World War, using propaganda with the Creel Committee to try to quell dissent and promote support for the U.S. war effort. This week, one thing also, before I get to the factoid, I just wanted to give you a little overview of the First World War. This week, we have a research paper in this class. It's a shorter research paper because I also have us writing the two book reviews. It's only a 6-page paper. However, this week, we're not doing a formal paper proposal. For those of you who have taken my classes before, where we haven't written the book reviews, but we've written the bigger paper proposal, we're not doing a formal paper proposal in this class. Instead, what I want this week is I want you to submit a topic, a potential thesis statement, and a list of 5 potential sources that you hope to use on this research paper. And the research paper can deal with any related topic to this course. So be sure to come up with a decent research topic. Take a look at some of the sources that we have on offer at our library, and check out the digital archives and the journal articles that our library has. And see if you can come up with a decent preliminary thesis statement. Preliminary, these things can change. Your sources can change. Your thesis statement can change. But I want to see us taking the steps to thinking about what we want to write these papers on. Okay. So here's the factoid. The factoid for this week, remember, for your bonus point, email me this factoid no later than Wednesday by midnight. Get that bonus point added to a test score at the end of the term. The factoid is this. After the United States became involved in the First World War, and the United States was involved in the First World War for a mere 585 days. not even 2 full years. And the amount of time the United States actually had, so to speak, boots on the ground fighting was even less than that. Even though the United States performed a fundamental role in events like the Meuse-Argonne Offensive and the Battle of Belleau Wood, the United States' actual combat time in the First World War was pretty short. And even after the war declaration in April of 1917, the United States was really only active in the war for 585 days. However, and this is the factoid, despite that fact, the United States was a not insignificant producer of chemical weapons. The United States produced thousands of tons of chemical weapons, and they produced upwards of 4 million gas masks as well. The chemical weapons included things like phosgene, chlorine gas, and of course mustard gas. World War I was a war of brutal industrial technologies of war: the machine gun, heavy artillery, the U-boat, tanks in their infancy, airplanes in their infancy, but also, of course, and maybe most notoriously remembered from the war, in line with things like trench warfare and explosive heavy artillery and the machine gun, is the usage of chemical weapons, of gas. And the factoid for this week is that the United States during the First World War was a significant manufacturer of chemical weapons. And the United States manufactured thousands of tons of chlorine gas, phosgene gas, and also mustard gas during the First World War. So that's the factoid for this week. Email me that factoid no later than Wednesday by midnight. Remember, we're reading Gene Son, Chapter 6. Also, the primary sources in modules. Please read all of those, and I'll see you in the discussion forum. Also, watch my lecture. I have a recorded lecture up for you, as always, on Woodrow Wilson in the First World War, and I outline some of his approaches to neutrality, to the First World War, his ideas behind the League of Nations, and so forth. So I'll see you in the discussion forum. Let's have a great week.